Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending my talk and our symposium. My name is Hossam Abdel Moniem. I'm a postdoc fellow at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, and I work with Helen Wagner and the Center for Urban Environment. I'm delighted to organize this symposium along with my co-chairs, Lindsay Miles and Sophie Britbart. My objective in my talk today is actually to pave the road for the upcoming wonderful talk that we will have today in our symposium. I'll start by introducing the impacts of urbanization and then move to why we care about landscape connectivity and why it's important. Then I will move to the three main blocks of my talk. I will discuss our perspectives on the landscape and the different modeling approaches that we use to model the landscape, and then the landscape genetics models that we use and the different genetic markers as well. Finally, I will end with a recap and a case study that is actually implementing these different approaches and techniques in an empirical study. So to get started, the picture that you see in front of you is a typical landscape that is impacted with urbanization. And due to habitat loss and fragmentation that is occurring due to human footprints, we can see that there is an alteration in the landscape structure and function, which can lead to a decline in landscape connectivity and therefore declines in biodiversity and gene flow. It's very important to maintain the biodiversity to promote the ecosystem services and the biodiversity in the ecosystem, as this in turns can help the quality of life for human beings. So what's actually landscape connectivity and why we care? We define landscape connectivity as the degree to which landscape facilitates or impedes the movement of individuals in the landscape among the resource patches. So in this picture, we have these corridors, the green patches or the green areas that you can see are the natural areas that is embedded in a typical environment that is impacted by the human landscapes. Landscape connectivity has two components, a structure and a functional component. The structural component is actually the physical characteristics of a landscape that allow for movement. So these green corridors and green patches are the physical features in this landscape that would facilitate the movement of terrestrial organisms in this landscape. However, the building blocks and roads are barriers to the movement of these individuals as a physical features in this landscape. The functional landscape, however, connectivity is the movement, the actual movement of these individuals through the landscape. So if we assume that we have some individuals that can move through these patches or corridors, then these are the actual functional connectivity. There are two components of the functional connectivity that we have. We have the potential functional connectivity and the actual functional connectivity. The potential functional connectivity can be based on the map and some assumptions about the movement behaviors of the individuals in the landscape. However, the actual functional connectivity is based on some actual movement data that can be extracted from molecular markers data, mark recaptures data, or radiotelemetry data. Promoting the connectivity is very important for ecosystem services, species conservation, and gene flow. For effective and useful modeling of landscape connectivity, we have to understand our perspective on the landscape. At the conceptual level, we can think of two axes of our perspective on the landscape. The first distinction occurs along the horizontal axis, where we have either a species conservation perspective or a land use planning perspective. In landscape genetics and conservation studies, we often base our studies on species perspective approach. This focus is compatible with modeling of connectivity based on the biology and ecology of species and results in models of potential and actual functional connectivity. We call this approach as well the bottom-up approach. In contrast, land use planning focuses on the sustainable development of multifunctional landscapes. This focus is highly compatible with the modeling of connectivity based on human modification, which will result in a model of structural landscape connectivity. We also call this the top-down perspective. In between, the ecological community's perspective can be placed, since species within communities share common biological and ecological characteristics, in addition sometimes to dispersal characteristics as well. These models could be built on by overlaying multiple species-specific models from the right side.
Another distinction across is the vertical axis, where we have the policy and ecology perspective. While ecology mainly consider natural processes, policy addresses human values and actions. The two perspectives meet in the consideration of human impact on the ecosystem. Along this axis, connectivity models quantify how human actions and their manifestation as non-natural landscape features constrains ecological flow across the underlying natural fabric of the landscape, with the goal of maintaining ecosystem services and biodiversity in the context of sustainable development.
So if we are talking about the species at risk management, then we are talking about the top right corner where we have to adopt a species conservation or where we have to adopt a species specific approach that is linked to some policy to manage and to protect the species at risk. Another example is if we consider the ecosystem services, then we are using a land use planning approach with some policy to promote these ecosystem services. And the biodiversity conservation in general comes in the middle of these two perspectives. So at the end, we might have a species agnostic approach where we focus more on the structure connectivity. We don't pay much attention to the details for the specific species. Rather, we model the landscape connectivity from a land use planning perspective and a structural connectivity. On the other side, we have a multi-species approach or a species-specific approach that focuses mainly on potential and functional connectivity. Both approaches can be validated with actual functional connectivity data. Now let's move to the second block, which is the different modeling approaches for the landscape. To start by modeling the landscape, we have first to decide on certain components. The first thing is the landscape focus, whether we are focusing on a local site or we are focusing on the intervening landscapes between sites. Let's consider this identical landscape for both situations. With the local sites, we start by identifying our sites and then start by collecting a site level variables that we can relate to our molecular data. For example, in this situation, we might be interested in the isolation by environment and how each site-specific conditions matters in changing the genetic content or the genetic makeup of the populations or the samples that were collected at these sites. For the intervening landscapes, however, we do have the same sites, but we are more interested in the intervening landscapes or the structure of the landscape itself between these two sites, and relate that to a genetic distance that is calculated between these site pairs. In this example, we have a landscape level variables, and an example for this would be isolation by resistance, for example, to understand how different features in this landscape or this intervening landscape can facilitate or impede the movement of the organisms between these sites. It's very important as well to consider the scale at which we are making our samples, because not all the species perceive the landscape the same. Then we move to the landscape representation, how we represent this landscape that we just selected to work with. We either have a categorical approach or a continuous approach. If we are working with a categorical approach, basically we summarize these different land use, land cover maps into something relevant to the species that I work with, and then I work with this categorical map. On the continuous map, however, it's different because we work with a continuous surface that represents, for example, a habitat suitability map for a certain species, and then we work with the suitability map to analyze the connectivity. Landscape connectivity approaches and metrics will depend on the map type or the approach that I use to model the landscape. If I work with a categorical based maps, then we have the patch mosaic models, for example, and some software that can calculate a suite of different metrics similar to FragStat and the landscape metrics package in R that was developed by Hasselprath et al. In 2019. If we have a continuous surface, however, there are different ways of quantifying connectivity across the surface. One method is the gradient surface model that is based on the topology of this surface. For example, if we build a habitat suitability surface, then we can evaluate the connectivity based on the topology of this surface of the peaks that represents high quality surfaces and valleys that represents low quality habitat. For more about this surface metrics that is powerful yet sophisticated technique, please have a look at Abdel Moniem et al. 2013 and 2016. Also, for the continuous surface metrics that we can use the least cost path and the multipath analysis in a resistance surface model, for example. These metrics are implemented in CircuitScape and GFlow. The last block that I would like to talk about is the landscape genetics models. We do have quite a suite of landscape models that we use in landscape genetics. These models depend on the purpose of the study, and it helps understanding the mechanism of gene flow in the landscape. We also use a suite of sampling techniques and molecular markers. These molecular markers helped advancing the field, and the sampling techniques, whether we sample at the individual level or at the population level, all of these are choices for us to make in our landscape genetic studies. Now, we might have a question about which model, markers, and sampling techniques I should use. And then, as we all know in landscape genetics, it depends on research question is the answer to many questions in the field. Finally, to recap, the landscape genetics is a powerful tool for managing human impacted landscape because it provides a framework that combines species perspective and human perspective to the landscape. It has a lot of models that can help us simplify the landscape and understand and evaluate the connectivity situation. And it has multiple models and sampling techniques and molecular markers that can be modified based on the study and help practitioners and researchers managing the human impacted landscapes. So it provides the science-based solutions for mitigations and management of human impacted landscapes. Finally, I would like to leave you with this case study. This case study is a product of the landscape genetics course online, the distributed graduate seminar course in 2018. Here's a picture of the group during our synthesis meeting in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. In this paper, we studied the alternative quantifications of landscape complementation to model the gene flow of a banded longhorn beetle. The paper is recently published in Frontiers in Genetics, so please have a look. With that, I would like to thank my advisor, Helen Wagner, my co-authors, my collaborators, and my funding agencies. And I would like to say a big thank you for the North American IALE Virtual Meeting Committee for making this available. And thank you very much for listening.